fonts set the tone of our web pages? Do we want formal with a serif font, or go casual with sans-serif? Okay, what's a serif? By default, the user's browser utilizes its set of fonts. There are a limited number of fonts generally available across all systems and devices. These are called web-safe fonts. In many cases, you'll want to use one of those for your website, but there are techniques for linking in custom fonts as you need. There are 3 primary types of web-safe fonts. Serif fonts have flourishes at the end of each character stroke. Notice the ends of each stroke in the letters T and N. Sans means without, so a sans-serif font has no serifs. That makes for a simpler and cleaner-looking font. Compare the T in Trebuchet to the T in Times. And a monospace font is for use when displaying code or other text that should be evenly spaced. A monospace font ensures each character takes up the same amount of space, allowing code and other content to be vertically aligned. With CSS, there are several properties we use to adjust the font of our text. We use font family to set the names of the fonts. Notice that we have multiple font names here, a font stack, if you will. Since we can't ensure that the font we want will be available on the user's device when the page is displayed, we provide the browser with several choices. The browser starts at the beginning of the stack and tries to use that font. If that font is not available on the device, it moves to the next font in the stack, and so on until it finds one it has. There are a few things to point out when creating the font stack. The font names are separated with commas. If the font name contains spaces, like Times New Roman in this example, it must be included in quotes. And it's a good idea to the generic name of the type of font we want, in this case a serif font. That way, if none of the supplied fonts are found, the browser can pick its suitable default font of the specified type. As you'd expect, font size sets the size of the font. The most common font units are px for pixels and em. A pixel is a picture element and defines a logical small square of the display. The actual physical size of a pixel depends on the user's display resolution. A pixel is considered to be an absolute unit as it results in the same size for a particular display. An em is a dynamic size determined as a multiplier of the element's parent font size. We'll look at an example of this shortly. And font weight sets how bold the text is. Instead of setting all of these individual font properties, we can use shorthand syntax and put all of the values on one property, font. Note that the properties must be defined in order, with the weight, then the size, then the family. Now let's give these a try. On our resume page, we'll try out some different fonts. I still have VS Code open with Live Server running and the browser displayed on the right. Let's try out some fonts with the new paragraphs we recently added. For the Skills-Languages class, let's set a font family. Oh! Notice how VS Code helps us with the entire font stack. It even knows to put in the quotes on any font names with spaces. Nice. Let's arrow down to Georgia. Let's set the font size to 32 pixels and the font weight to bold. In the browser, we see the language text a bit larger and bolder. Normally, we'd want a consistent set of fonts for our site, but we want to try out a couple of different fonts. Let's add a font to the Skills-Web class. Set the font family to a sans-serif font. How about Arial? Notice that VS Code adds Helvetica and the generic sans-serif to the font stack. With this class, let's set the font size using em as the units. We'll set it to 2em. What did that just do? Let's look at the index.html file. This paragraph's parent element is section, and its parent element is main. We haven't set a font size for either of these elements, so it uses the browser's default font size of 16 pixels. Going back to the styles, since an em is a multiplier, 2 times 16 is 32, making the font size of our web skills the same as our languages. But let's try this. Going back to the index.html file, add a div element around the Web Skills paragraph. Be sure the generated closing div element tag is after the closing p element tag. This div element is now the parent of our paragraph element. Let's give the div element a class of skills-highlight. Then back in the style sheet, let's add a style declaration with a skills-highlight class selector. Set the font size to 24 pixels. Looking at the browser, our web skills are now significantly larger. The 2EM multiplied the 24 pixel of its parent container by 2 for a size of 48 pixels. Feel free to try out different font sizes for the parent div element and the child paragraph element to see the effect of the EM units. Now add font properties for the skills-repo selector. How about viewer's choice? Try out any of the font properties. When you're finished, close the browser and in VS Code stop Live Server. Then we'll go back to the slides. So, we can set the tone of our site by selecting an appropriate font. Use the font family to define the set, or stack, of fonts for the browser to choose from. The browser will use the first one that is available on the user's system from that stack. End the stack with a generic font type, such as sans-serif, in case all else fails. Use the font size to set the size of the font. Use pixels for absolute units. The default size of the font is 16 pixels. Use EM for dynamic units, determined as a multiplier of the parent container's font size. Use font weight to set the amount of bold. Next up, let's explore the CSS box model. If you like this video, please like and subscribe.